Gerald Whitmore laughed first. The sound carried across the ballroom of Hellbrook Financial's Honor Gala, sharp enough to make nearby conversations stop. "Well, look who wandered in," he said, staring at the woman by the champagne table. Noelle Davenport. Didn't realize this event had started letting in people who don't belong. A few colleagues shifted uncomfortably. Some recognized her name. Gerald only smiled wider, unaware of the quiet truth already standing in the room. The woman he was mocking had arrived as the wife of the man who owned his entire career. Before the story begins, take a moment to settle in. Stories about dignity, truth, and quiet strength often unfold slowly, but they stay with us long after they end. If you're watching tonight, let me know where in the world you are and what your local time is. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. And if you believe that character eventually reveals itself, no matter how long it takes, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the stories that explore exactly that. Now, let's begin. Long before the ballroom lights of Hellbrook Financial's annual gala, before the silk dresses and crystal glasses and polite corporate applause, there had been a quieter life. A smaller apartment, a narrow kitchen with an old wooden table, and two people who once believed they were building something together. Noelle Davenport had never been a woman who demanded attention. Even in college, when others competed loudly for recognition, she preferred careful observation. She listened more than she spoke. She wrote things down: appointments, numbers, fragments of conversations. Not because she was suspicious by nature, but because precision comforted her. Order made the world understandable. She studied administrative management and financial operations fields, where quiet competence mattered more than charisma. Her professors described her the same way again and again: reliable, thorough, composed. Those traits would shape much of her life. They were also the traits Gerald Whitmore once claimed to admire. When Noelle first met Gerald, he was not yet the polished, ambitious corporate figure he later tried so hard to become. He was simply a young analyst trying to climb his way into the world of finance. They met at a modest networking event hosted by a local business association in Chicago. Gerald had arrived late. His tie crooked, his voice carrying across the room with the restless energy of someone who believed success was always just one conversation away. Noelle had been helping the organizers manage check-ins at the front desk. Gerald noticed her because she was the only person in the room who didn't seem impressed by him. He talked easily. He was confident, quick with jokes, quick with ideas about the future. Noelle listened. At the time, Gerald mistook her quietness for admiration. In truth, she was simply measuring him. Their relationship began the way many young relationships do, through late dinners, long conversations about careers, and shared optimism about what the future might hold. Gerald dreamed big, very big. He talked about corporate leadership, about boardrooms, about one day sitting among people who shaped markets and industries. To him, success was not just financial security. It was recognition, visibility, status. Noelle never mocked those dreams. In fact, she supported them more than he ever realized. When Gerald struggled during his early years at Hellbrook Financial Group, it was Noelle who helped keep their life stable. She organized their finances carefully. She built spreadsheets, tracking expenses. She reminded him of meetings, edited resumes, helped him rehearse presentations late into the night. Sometimes she stayed awake long after he had fallen asleep, quietly reviewing documents or proofreading reports he planned to submit the next day. Gerald used to joke that Noelle had a better memory than any computer. "Good thing you're on my side," he once said, laughing. At the time, he meant it. But success changes people slowly, and rarely in ways they notice themselves. Gerald's first promotion came 3 years into their marriage. It wasn't a major leadership role, just a step up from analyst to project coordinator, but to Gerald, it felt like the first door opening into the world he believed he deserved. The change began subtly. Longer work hours, more attention to appearance, more stories about colleagues with expensive houses, prestigious partners, and glamorous social lives. At first, Noelle simply listened the same way she always had. But eventually, the tone of those conversations began to shift. One evening, while Gerald was scrolling through photos from a corporate charity event, he paused on an image of one of his managers standing beside his wife. She wore a designer dress, smiling confidently in front of a backdrop filled with company logos. "See that?" Gerald said, tilting the phone toward Noelle. "She used to work in corporate law. Now she runs her own consulting firm." Noelle nodded politely. "That's impressive." Gerald shrugged. "Yeah, makes a difference when someone's partner actually fits the environment." The words were casual, almost careless, but something inside them lingered. It was the first time Gerald had implied that Noelle didn't. After that, the comparisons appeared more often. At company dinners, Gerald would quietly point out the spouses of senior executives. "She used to work at Goldman. Her family owns real estate. They understand how this world works." Noelle rarely responded beyond a small nod. Not because she didn't hear the meaning behind the comments, but because she did. Very clearly. The truth was that Noelle had never wanted the kind of public life Gerald increasingly admired. She valued stability, privacy, and quiet competence. Those qualities, however, were not glamorous in the corporate circles Gerald was trying to enter. Eventually, the comments became sharper. "You could try being more social," Gerald once said after a networking dinner. "You barely spoke to anyone." "I spoke when it was necessary," Noelle replied calmly. "That's the problem," Gerald said. He didn't realize how revealing the statement was, because what he really meant was something different. He wanted a partner who enhanced his image, someone who could stand beside him in a crowded room and make people look twice. Noelle had never been interested in being that kind of ornament. And gradually, the distance between them grew. Arguments were rare. Noelle didn't argue loudly. She simply withdrew. But while Gerald interpreted her silence as indifference, it was actually something else. Observation. She noticed the changes in his financial habits. New expenses that didn't match his explanations. Company reimbursements that arrived weeks later than expected. Transfers between accounts that Gerald brushed off with vague comments about temporary adjustments. Noelle didn't accuse him of anything. She simply did what she had always done. She documented things. Bank statements were saved. Email confirmations were archived. Expense reports were copied into organized folders. Not because she believed Gerald was doing anything illegal, but because his explanations kept shifting, and inconsistencies bothered her. Gerald, meanwhile, grew increasingly impatient with what he saw as her lack of ambition. "You're too comfortable with small things," he told her once during an argument. "Noelle, this world doesn't reward people who stay invisible." She didn't answer immediately. Then she said quietly, "Sometimes being invisible lets you see more." Gerald laughed. He thought she was being philosophical. He never realized she was being literal. By the time the marriage ended, Gerald believed the story was simple. He had outgrown the relationship. He was moving toward a bigger future. Noelle had remained small. The divorce itself was surprisingly quiet. No shouting, no dramatic confrontations, just paperwork signatures, and a final meeting in a lawyer's office where both of them spoke with restrained politeness. Gerald walked out feeling relieved, free. As he told a colleague a few weeks later, sometimes you just realize someone isn't built for the life you're heading toward. What Gerald didn't realize was that Noelle had walked away with something he had completely forgotten about. Years of records, emails, statements, copies, dates. She placed them carefully into labeled folders the same way she organized everything else in her life. Then she closed the box. Not with anger, not with revenge in mind, just with the quiet understanding that truth has a way of waiting patiently, even when people don't believe it exists anymore. For a while, Gerald Whitmore believed he had left that entire chapter behind him. He believed Noelle Davenport had disappeared into a smaller life somewhere beyond the edges of his growing world. And for a time, that belief felt comfortable. But the truth was simpler. Noelle hadn't disappeared at all. She had only stepped out of his view. And the records she kept, those careful, quiet details Gerald had once joked about, were still exactly where she had left them. Waiting. After the divorce, Noelle Davenport did not disappear dramatically the way Gerald Whitmore liked to imagine. There were no emotional messages sent late at night, no attempts to revisit the past, no public scenes. She simply moved. Her new apartment was smaller than the one she had shared with Gerald. It was located in an older building on a quiet street in the northern part of Chicago, where the sidewalks were lined with trees and the noise of downtown traffic softened into distant echoes. The living room held only what she needed: a modest couch, a wooden desk by the window, shelves filled with neatly arranged folders and books. Noelle had always preferred spaces that allowed her to think. The weeks after the divorce passed with a kind of calm routine that many people would have mistaken for loneliness. But for Noelle, the silence was not emptiness. It was clarity. She woke early each morning: coffee, a short walk, work. She had accepted a position as an administrative operations specialist for a mid-sized consulting firm. The work required attention to detail tracking contracts, coordinating internal records, reviewing expense documentation, tasks that others sometimes found tedious. But to Noelle, it was familiar territory: precision, consistency, structure. Her supervisors quickly noticed something unusual about her. Noelle rarely made mistakes. If a discrepancy appeared in a report, she found it. If an invoice contained inconsistent numbers, she noticed. She never raised her voice when pointing out errors. She simply provided the facts and quietly corrected them. It was the same skill that had once kept Gerald's life organized, but now it belonged entirely to her. In the evenings, Noelle returned to her apartment and gradually began sorting through the remaining boxes from her previous life. Photographs, old notebooks, documents. Most people would have thrown many of those things away. Divorce often brings with it the urge to erase everything connected to the past. Noelle didn't erase. She reviewed. One evening, nearly 4 months after the separation, she opened a box labeled simply Financial Records. Inside were folders she had created over the years of her marriage, each one carefully dated. She sat at the desk by the window and began looking through them. Bank statements, email confirmations, expense reports Gerald had forwarded to her during the years he worked his way up at Hellbrook Financial Group. At first, she was simply organizing. But gradually, small inconsistencies began resurfacing. Numbers she had once noticed, but never fully examined. Transfers between accounts that Gerald had explained quickly at the time. Just temporary. Work reimbursement. Internal adjustments. She had believed him then, or perhaps more accurately, she had chosen not to push the question further. Now, with distance and quiet time, the details looked different. One transfer caught her attention. A reimbursement Gerald had claimed came from a company travel expense. But the bank routing information suggested something else. She opened her laptop and cross-checked the date with the email records she had saved. Another detail appeared, then another. None of it immediately proved wrongdoing, but it created a pattern, and patterns mattered. Noelle did not jump to conclusions. Instead, she created a new folder. She labeled it with the same calm precision she used for everything else cross-reference. Over the next few weeks, she slowly reviewed more documents, not obsessively, just methodically. When she noticed something unusual, she placed a copy inside the new folder. Then she moved on. Her life continued at its steady rhythm: work, reading, occasional dinners with a small circle of acquaintances she had met through professional workshops and community events. It was during one of those events that she met Jonathan Reeves. The gathering itself was unremarkable. A public lecture hosted by a downtown cultural foundation discussing ethical leadership in modern business. Most of the attendees were professionals from various industries. Jonathan Reeves arrived quietly without the kind of dramatic entrance people often expected from someone in his position. At the time, Noelle didn't even know who he was. She noticed him the way she noticed many things, through observation. He listened carefully during the presentation. He didn't interrupt speakers. When he asked questions, they were thoughtful and precise rather than performative. After the event, people gathered in small groups near the coffee tables to continue discussing the topic. Jonathan ended up standing beside Noelle while they both waited for the crowd to thin. "You took a lot of notes," he said, glancing at the small notebook she held. His tone carried mild curiosity rather than judgment. Noelle closed the notebook. "I like remembering things accurately." Jonathan nodded. "That's a rare habit these days." She studied him briefly. There was something calm about him. Not the restless ambition she had seen so often in corporate environments. Just quiet confidence. "What did you think of the speaker?" he asked. Noelle considered the question. "He spoke well about ethics," she said, "but he described them as ideals." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "And you disagree?" "I think ethics are systems," she replied. "Ideals only matter if they're supported by structures that make dishonesty difficult." Jonathan's expression changed slightly. Not surprise, recognition. "That's a very operational way of thinking," he said. "I work in operations." They spoke for another 10 minutes. Nothing dramatic. No flirtation. Just two people discussing systems leadership and the way organizations often ignore small warning signs until problems grow too large to hide. When they finally parted, Jonathan simply said, "I enjoyed the conversation, Miss Davenport." He paused. Jonathan Reeves. The name meant nothing to Noelle at the time. It wasn't until several weeks later, when she saw his photograph in a financial publication, that she realized who he was. CEO of Hellbrook Financial Group, the same company where Gerald Whitmore worked. Noelle stared at the article for a long moment. Then she closed the magazine. The coincidence was strange, but coincidences happen in large cities. She didn't think about it again until a month later, when Jonathan Reeves appeared at another event hosted by the same foundation. This time, he approached her directly. "I was hoping you might be here," he said. Noelle smiled slightly. "Why?" "Because your comment about ethics being systems stayed with me." He gestured toward the conference hall. "Most people talk about values. You talked about processes." They sat together during the lecture, and afterward they walked several blocks through the evening streets discussing organizational transparency data tracking, and how quiet administrative roles often see more truth than executive offices realize. Jonathan listened carefully when Noelle spoke. He never interrupted, never tried to dominate the conversation. That alone made him different from many people she had met in corporate environments. Over the next few months, their paths crossed again, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by coincidence. Their conversations remained thoughtful, unhurried. Jonathan eventually asked about her past, not in a probing way, just with genuine curiosity. Noelle told him only the simplest version. "I was married once," she said. "And now?" "Now I'm not." Jonathan didn't ask further questions. He respected the boundary, but he sensed something else. Not bitterness, not resentment, just history, and a kind of quiet strength that often forms only after someone has endured disappointment and chosen to rebuild anyway. Meanwhile, far across the city in the polished offices of Hellbrook Financial Group, Gerald Whitmore continued climbing his way through the corporate hierarchy. His confidence grew with every promotion. His reputation expanded. His social circle widened. When people occasionally asked about his previous marriage, Gerald usually dismissed the topic with a casual wave of his hand. It just didn't work out, he would say. And in his mind, that explanation was enough. He never wondered what had become of Noelle Davenport. Because in Gerald's version of the story, she had faded into the background long ago. What he didn't realize was that the quiet woman he had once overlooked was now walking through the same city, living her life carefully, methodically, and slowly building a future that Gerald had never imagined. A future that would eventually lead both of them into the same room again. But next time, the balance of power would be very different. The first few times Noelle Davenport and Jonathan Reeves met after that lecture, neither of them described it as anything significant. There was no sudden romance, no dramatic moment, just conversation. They met again at another discussion hosted by the same civic foundation, this time about financial transparency in large corporations. The room was filled with analysts, consultants, legal professionals, and a handful of executives who preferred to attend quietly rather than speak publicly. Jonathan sat in the back row. Noelle noticed him the same way she had the first night, by the way he listened. Not impatiently, not waiting for his turn to speak, but genuinely absorbing what others were saying. After the lecture ended, they walked outside together into the cool Chicago evening. "You were right the first time," Jonathan said as they crossed the street toward a coffee shop that stayed open late for downtown workers, about ethics being systems. Noelle glanced at him. "You sound like you tested the idea." Jonathan smiled faintly. "In my position, you learn quickly that value statements on a wall don't stop misconduct. And systems they make it harder to hide," he said. Inside the cafe, the quiet hum of espresso machines filled the air. They found a small table near the window. Jonathan asked about her work. Noelle described her role in operations management, tracking documentation, reviewing financial processes, identifying inconsistencies before they turned into larger problems. "It sounds meticulous," Jonathan said. "It is," Noelle replied. "And you enjoy it?" She considered the question. "I enjoy clarity," she said. "And clarity usually comes from details." Jonathan leaned back slightly in his chair. "Most people prefer big decisions," he said. "They overlook the details that make those decisions possible." "That's why systems fail," Noelle said calmly. Jonathan studied her for a moment. "Has anyone ever told you that you see organizations the way auditors do?" "No." "But you're not an auditor?" "No." "Then what are you?" Noelle smiled slightly. "Someone who notices patterns." Jonathan laughed softly. That might be even more dangerous. Their conversations continued like that over the following weeks. Thoughtful, analytical, free of the usual posturing that often accompanied corporate networking. They spoke about leadership failures, about corporate scandals, about the strange tendency of organizations to ignore warning signs that appear quietly long before problems explode into public crises. Jonathan rarely spoke about himself. But gradually, through context and small comments, Noelle began to understand the scale of his responsibilities. As CEO of Hellbrook Financial Group, Jonathan oversaw thousands of employees across multiple states. He attended board meetings, negotiated major acquisitions, and carried the kind of pressure that rarely appeared in public interviews. Yet, when he spoke with Noelle, that weight seemed to disappear. With her, he didn't need to perform. He could simply think out loud. One evening, nearly 4 months after their first conversation, they walked along the Chicago River after dinner. The city lights reflected across the water, stretching into long ribbons of gold and silver. Jonathan stopped beside the railing. "You've never asked me why I keep showing up at these events," he said. Noelle rested her hands lightly on the cool metal railing. "I assumed you were interested in the topics." Jonathan shook his head. "I am." He paused. "But that's not the whole reason." Noelle turned toward him slightly. Jonathan's voice remained calm. "You're one of the few people I've met who talks about business without pretending it's something heroic." "That's because it isn't," Noelle said. "It's systems, incentives, and accountability." Jonathan smiled. "That's exactly why I enjoy talking with you." The conversation lingered in the air for a moment. Then Jonathan asked quietly, "Would you have dinner with me sometime without a lecture involved?" Noelle didn't answer immediately, not because she was uncertain about Jonathan, but because experience had taught her to think carefully about new beginnings. Finally, she nodded once. Yes. Their relationship developed slowly after that. Jonathan never rushed anything. He never tried to impress her with wealth or influence. In fact, during their early dinners together, he rarely spoke about his position at all. He asked questions, listened, observed, and gradually he came to understand something important about Noelle Davenport. Her calmness was not passivity. It was strength. She had endured disappointment before and rebuilt herself without bitterness. That kind of resilience was rare. Months later, when Noelle finally told Jonathan more about her previous marriage, she did so without anger. She simply described the facts. Gerald Whitmore, ambitious, restless, eventually convinced that success required a different kind of partner. Jonathan listened quietly. "Do you regret it?" he asked when she finished. "No," Noelle said. "Not even the ending. Know why?" "Because people eventually show you who they are," she said. "Sometimes it just takes time." Jonathan nodded slowly. That's true. Neither of them mentioned the fact that Gerald Whitmore still worked at Hellbrook Financial Group. At least not yet. Meanwhile, Gerald's career inside the company continued to accelerate. He had recently been promoted to a senior project manager role, overseeing several investment initiatives. His confidence had grown alongside his reputation. In meetings, he spoke assertively. He dressed sharply. He cultivated relationships with executives whenever possible. Among his colleagues, Gerald had developed a reputation as someone who understood how to navigate corporate politics. What he didn't realize was that some of the financial processes within his department had begun attracting quiet attention from the company's internal compliance teams. Small inconsistencies, nothing dramatic, yet. Expense reports that required clarification, timing irregularities between reimbursements and project accounts. In large corporations, such anomalies often appeared harmless at first, but they rarely disappeared completely. And inside Hellbrook Financial Group, there were systems designed to notice those patterns. Jonathan Reeves believed strongly in those systems. He had spent years strengthening the company's internal oversight structures after watching other financial institutions collapse under the weight of hidden misconduct. Transparency, documentation, verification, those principles guided nearly every operational policy he introduced. And somewhere inside those vast networks of financial records and administrative tracking, small threads had begun connecting. Threads that would eventually lead back to Gerald Whitmore. But at that moment, Gerald had no reason to feel concerned. He was thriving. His name had recently been included among the candidates for recognition at Hellbrook Financial's upcoming annual Leadership Honor Gala, a prestigious internal event celebrating employees who had delivered exceptional performance during the year. The invitation alone carried status. It meant executives had noticed his work. Gerald spoke proudly about it to colleagues. "This is the kind of exposure that leads to bigger things," he said one afternoon during lunch. "What kind of bigger things?" a coworker asked. Gerald smiled confidently. "Leadership roles. What about the executive level?" someone joked. Gerald didn't laugh. "That's exactly where I'm heading." Confidence radiated from him. He believed his future inside Hellbrook Financial was only beginning. What Gerald could not see, what he had never imagined, was that two entirely separate parts of his life were quietly moving toward each other. On one side of the city, Noelle Davenport continued building a steady life defined by patience, clarity, and quiet strength. On the other side, Gerald Whitmore was preparing to step into a spotlight he believed would confirm his success. Between those two paths stood Jonathan Reeves, a man who valued truth more than appearances. A man who had already begun to understand the depth of the woman beside him. And soon, whether anyone intended it or not, those paths would intersect. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in the calm, unavoidable way that truth eventually finds its way into the open. The decision to marry did not arrive dramatically in Noelle Davenport's life. There was no grand proposal in a crowded restaurant, no audience, no spectacle. It happened during a quiet Sunday afternoon in early autumn. Jonathan Reeves had invited Noelle to walk through Lincoln Park, where the trees had just begun turning shades of amber and deep red. Families passed slowly along the paths. Joggers moved along the lakeshore trail, their footsteps steady against the cool air drifting from Lake Michigan. Jonathan and Noelle walked without hurry. Their conversations had long since moved beyond polite discussions about work or public topics. By then, they understood each other in ways that rarely required explanation. They spoke about responsibility, about how power changed people, about the strange loneliness that sometimes came with leadership. Jonathan had told her more about his role at Hellbrook Financial Group, not in the language of corporate success, but in the language of accountability. A company that size, he once said, is really a network of trust. Investors trust us, employees trust us, clients trust us. And when that trust breaks, Noelle asked. Jonathan looked out across the lake. Then the entire system collapses. That afternoon in the park, Jonathan stopped beside a quiet stretch of water where ducks moved slowly through the reflection of autumn trees. He did not kneel. He simply turned to her. "Noelle," he said calmly, "I don't want to build a life that's divided between the person I am at work and the person I am outside of it." She listened. Jonathan continued. "With you, those two things feel aligned." Noelle's expression remained thoughtful. Jonathan did not rush the moment. "I would like you to marry me," he said. There was no pressure in his voice, only sincerity. Noelle looked at the water for a moment. Her life had already contained one marriage, one experience of watching admiration slowly turn into disappointment. But Jonathan had never treated her as a reflection of his status. He valued her mind, her steadiness, her way of seeing things others overlooked. Finally, she nodded. Yes. The wedding itself took place quietly a few months later. A small ceremony, a handful of close friends. No media attention. Jonathan Reeves was well known within financial circles, but he had always been careful about separating his personal life from corporate visibility. For that reason, their marriage was not widely announced inside Hellbrook Financial Group. Only a few senior board members and trusted associates knew. Not because Jonathan wished to hide his wife, but because he understood something important about corporate dynamics. Power attracted attention, and attention often attracted complications. Noelle had no desire to become a symbol of influence within the company where Jonathan served as CEO. She continued living exactly the way she had before. The same apartment at first, the same quiet routines. Eventually, she moved into Jonathan's home, but even then, her habits remained unchanged. She woke early, organized documents, read extensively, and continued working. Jonathan never asked her to stop. In fact, he admired the independence. People often assume power changes everything, he told her once. But the strongest people I know are the ones who keep their structure no matter where they are. Noelle smiled faintly. Structure is what keeps systems honest. Meanwhile, across the city, Gerald Whitmore's world was expanding quickly. His promotion to senior project manager had placed him closer to executive leadership than ever before. He attended strategy meetings, led presentations, managed larger budgets. And increasingly, he saw himself as someone destined for even greater influence inside Hellbrook Financial. Gerald enjoyed the attention that came with his rising reputation. At corporate gatherings, he spoke confidently about growth strategies, investment opportunities, and long-term financial positioning. Colleagues often listened with interest. Some admired his ambition, others quietly questioned his confidence. But Gerald interpreted every nod of approval as confirmation that he was on the right path. Occasionally, someone would mention his past. "You used to be married, right?" a coworker once asked during a happy hour gathering. Gerald shrugged casually. "Yeah, that was a long time ago." "What happened? Different directions?" Gerald replied. Then he added with a small laugh, "Some people just aren't built for the kind of life this career demands." The comment passed without much reaction, but it revealed something about how Gerald viewed the past. In his mind, the divorce had been a correction, a necessary adjustment on his path toward success. He rarely thought about Noelle anymore. When he did, it was only briefly. A vague memory of someone who had not understood his ambitions, Someone who had been too quiet, too cautious, too content with an ordinary life. Meanwhile, the reality of Noelle's life was quietly becoming anything but ordinary. Not because she had married a powerful executive, but because she had never allowed her identity to depend on that power. Inside Jonathan's home office one evening, Noelle sat reviewing the old financial documents she had carried with her through the divorce. The box had moved with her when she relocated. It sat now on a shelf beside Jonathan's books on corporate governance and financial regulation. Jonathan noticed it one evening as he passed the room. "You still keep those?" he asked gently. Noelle looked up. "Yes." "Why?" She paused before answering. "Because questions that remain unanswered don't disappear." Jonathan leaned against the doorframe. "Do you think there's something illegal there?" "I don't know," Noelle said honestly. "But there are inconsistencies." Jonathan didn't immediately respond. Instead, he walked into the room and looked down at the neatly organized folders. Dates, bank statements, copies of reimbursement forms, email confirmations. Everything arranged with careful precision. "You collected all of this while you were married?" he asked. "Yes." "Did Gerald know?" "No." Jonathan nodded slowly. He recognized something in those folders. Not revenge, not anger, just documentation. Evidence preserved without emotion. "You've been building a record," he said quietly. "No," Noelle replied. "I've been keeping information." Jonathan understood the distinction. For the moment, he chose not to ask more questions, but the conversation lingered in his thoughts. Because Jonathan Reeves had spent his career building corporate systems designed to detect exactly the kinds of patterns Noelle had described. Patterns of financial inconsistency. Patterns of unexplained movement of funds. Patterns that often began quietly before evolving into something larger. At Hellbrook Financial Group, those systems existed across thousands of transactions every day. Most irregularities turned out to be simple administrative errors. But occasionally, very rarely, they pointed towards something else. Something deliberate, something hidden. And somewhere inside those enormous networks of financial data, subtle patterns had begun appearing. Patterns connected to accounts managed within Gerald Whitmore's department. At first, they looked insignificant. Small discrepancies, timing delays, unusual reimbursement structures. Nothing dramatic. But systems designed carefully enough rarely ignored patterns forever. They simply continued gathering information, waiting. The same way Noelle Davenport had quietly gathered her own records years earlier. Neither Gerald nor most of his colleagues knew that the company's annual Leadership Honor Gala was approaching with particular significance that year. For Gerald, it represented recognition, visibility, validation. For others inside Hellbrook Financial's compliance teams, the event simply marked the end of the fiscal quarter. A time when financial systems were reviewed carefully, data compared, reports verified. Gerald looked forward to the gala with growing anticipation. It would be held in one of Chicago's most prestigious downtown hotels. Senior executives would attend, board members, key investors, and rising leaders within the company. He had already selected the suit he planned to wear, dark charcoal, perfectly tailored. He imagined conversations with influential figures, new opportunities opening. What Gerald did not know was that the same evening would bring him face to face with someone he believed had disappeared from his life entirely. One who had spent years quietly observing the details he once dismissed. And someone who now stood beside the most powerful man in his professional world. But that collision had not happened yet. For now, the city continued moving through its routines. Lights reflected across the Chicago River. Office towers glowed late into the night. And in two very different homes across the city, two people were preparing for the same event, each carrying a completely different understanding of what the future held. By early winter, the announcement circulated quietly through the internal channels of Hellbrook Financial Group. The annual Leadership Honor Gala would take place in 3 weeks. For most employees, it was simply another corporate event. A formal dinner, a few speeches, awards recognizing performance, and polite networking beneath chandeliers and camera flashes. But for those inside the company's leadership structure, the gala carried greater significance. It was where reputations solidified, where rising executives were introduced to board members, where careers sometimes accelerated or stalled based on impressions made in a single evening. Gerald Whitmore understood that better than most. When he saw his name listed among the honorees for outstanding strategic project leadership, he allowed himself a long moment of quiet satisfaction. This, he believed, was proof. Proof that his ambition had been justified. Proof that every late night, every calculated conversation, every carefully crafted presentation had been worth it. He leaned back in his office chair and read the announcement email again. The gala would be held at the Grand Meridian Hotel, one of the most prestigious venues in downtown Chicago. Attendance would include senior executives, major clients, and selected employees who had delivered exceptional results during the fiscal year. Gerald imagined the room immediately. The lights, the applause, the subtle shift in how colleagues would see him afterward. Recognition mattered in corporate life, not just for ego, but for momentum. And Gerald was very conscious of momentum. Later that afternoon, he walked into the break area where several coworkers were discussing the upcoming event. "Looks like someone's getting their moment," one of them said, nodding toward Gerald. Gerald smiled modestly. "It's a team effort." But the pride in his voice was difficult to hide. Still another colleague said that award puts you on leadership radar. "That's the idea," Gerald replied. They spoke about the gala for several minutes, who might attend, which executives would be present, what the evening might mean for future promotions. Eventually, someone asked half-jokingly, "So are you bringing a date?" Gerald laughed. "I might. Someone from outside the company." "Probably," Gerald said. Then he added casually, "Corporate events are easier when you don't bring personal history with you." The comment sounded light, but it carried an edge. One coworker tilted his head slightly, meaning Gerald shrugged. "Let's just say I've learned my lesson about mixing the wrong people into the professional world." The others chuckled politely. No one pressed the topic further. Gerald rarely mentioned his former marriage in detail. When he did, it was always framed the same way, an example of why ambition required the right environment. In his mind, Noelle Davenport had simply belonged to a different life. A smaller one. Meanwhile, across the city, Noelle stood in front of a large mirror, adjusting the sleeve of a dark blue dress. The fabric was elegant but understated, exactly the kind of clothing she preferred. Jonathan Reeves stood behind her in the doorway of the bedroom, watching quietly. "You look perfect," he said. Noelle glanced at him in the mirror. "Perfect isn't necessary." Jonathan smiled. "Tonight, it might help." She turned slightly. "You're still certain about bringing me?" Jonathan stepped into the room. "Of course. The company doesn't know about us," she said. "Not officially," Jonathan replied. "That may change soon anyway." Noelle studied his expression. Jonathan rarely made decisions lightly. "Will it create complications?" she asked. "It might create curiosity," he admitted. "But hiding my life indefinitely isn't realistic." He paused, then added gently, "And I don't intend to hide you." Noelle nodded slowly. She understood the complexity of Jonathan's position. Corporate environments often magnified personal relationships in ways that had little to do with reality. Still, she had no desire to appear as someone benefiting from influence. Jonathan seemed to sense that thought. "You won't be there as an executive's accessory," he said calmly. "You'll be there because you're my wife." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Noelle turned back toward the mirror, smoothing a small crease in the fabric of her sleeve. "What happens when people ask questions?" she said. Jonathan shrugged lightly. "Then we answer them. And if someone reacts badly," Jonathan's expression remained calm, "then that tells us something useful." He walked closer. "Noelle," he said quietly, "you've spent years observing systems. You know how people behave when power shifts. She met his eyes. Yes. Then tonight will simply be another observation. Noelle allowed herself a small smile. An interesting one. Meanwhile, at his apartment across town, Gerald Whitmore was finishing his final preparations for the evening. The suit he had chosen fit perfectly. He adjusted his cufflinks while studying his reflection in the mirror. He looked successful, confident, exactly the image he wanted to present inside the Grand Meridian Ballroom. His phone buzzed with messages from coworkers already arriving at the venue. Gerald grabbed his coat and left his apartment. The winter air outside carried a sharp chill as he stepped onto the sidewalk and hailed a rideshare. During the drive downtown, he glanced at the city lights passing through the window. Chicago's skyline rose above the river like a wall of glass and steel. He had once arrived in this city as a young analyst with uncertain prospects. Tonight he believed he was returning as someone who belonged among its decision-makers. The car stopped outside the Grand Meridian Hotel. Valets moved quickly along the entrance as guests stepped out beneath the warm glow of overhead lights. Inside the lobby buzzed with quiet excitement. Gerald walked through the revolving doors and immediately spotted several colleagues near the registration table. Whitmore, one of them, called. "You ready for your big moment?" Gerald laughed. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." But the confidence in his posture was unmistakable. He accepted a glass of champagne and joined the group as they moved toward the ballroom. The room itself was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling. Round tables filled the floor, each decorated with elegant centerpieces. Soft music drifted from a live string quartet near the stage. Executives mingled near the front of the room, greeting investors and board members. Gerald scanned the space with careful interest. Every detail of the environment mattered. Who stood near whom? Which conversations carried influence? This was the arena where future opportunities quietly formed. Across the room, employees from different departments began arriving in steady waves. Gerald recognized faces from compliance operations and executive leadership. He smiled, shook hands, exchanged polite greetings. Everything felt exactly as he had imagined. Recognition, respect, momentum. What Gerald could not see yet was a car pulling up outside the hotel entrance. Inside that car sat Jonathan Reeves and Noelle Davenport. The driver opened the door. Jonathan stepped out first, then offered his hand to Noelle. She accepted it calmly. Cold evening air brushed against her face as she stepped onto the sidewalk. For a moment she paused, looking up at the towering hotel entrance and the lights shining through the ballroom windows above. Jonathan noticed. "Nervous?" he asked gently. "No," Noelle said. She simply watched the building for another second. Then she added quietly, "Curious." Jonathan smiled slightly. About what? About how systems behave when two very different realities collide. Jonathan understood immediately. Inside that ballroom, Gerald Whitmore was standing among colleagues who believed they understood exactly where everyone belonged. But systems, whether financial, corporate, or human, often reveal their true structure only when unexpected variables appeared. And tonight, one such variable had just stepped out of a car. Noelle took Jonathan's arm. Together they walked toward the entrance. Inside the ballroom, Gerald Whitmore raised his champagne glass and laughed at something a coworker had just said. He had no idea the evening was about to change in ways he could not possibly predict. Not yet. But very soon. Inside the Grand Meridian Ballroom, the evening had settled into the smooth rhythm that corporate events often developed once the first wave of arrivals had passed. Conversations drifted between tables. Soft laughter rose and faded beneath the glow of chandeliers. Waiters moved quietly across the carpet carrying trays of champagne and small plates arranged with careful precision. Gerald Whitmore stood with a group of colleagues near the center of the room, his posture relaxed but alert in the way ambitious professionals often carried themselves at gatherings like this. He was enjoying himself. Recognition had a way of loosening people's conversations. Several coworkers had already congratulated him for the award nomination, and Gerald accepted the praise with carefully measured humility. Honestly, he said to one of them, this project was a group effort. But the slight lift in his voice suggested he knew exactly whose name would be announced later that evening. Across the ballroom, more guests continued arriving. Some were investors. Others were senior staff from departments that rarely interacted directly with Gerald's team. He scanned the room occasionally, cataloging faces, gauging which conversations might be worth joining later. That was when he saw her. At first, it was only a glimpse. A familiar profile near the entrance. Dark hair pulled neatly back. A composed posture he recognized immediately. Gerald frowned slightly. For a moment he assumed he had mistaken someone else for her. But when the woman stepped fully into the light beneath one of the chandeliers, the recognition became unmistakable. Noelle Davenport, his former wife. Gerald blinked. The room around him seemed to shift slightly as his mind tried to reconcile what he was seeing. This made no sense. Noelle had never been part of this world. Corporate galas, executive gatherings, leadership recognition events. Those places had never interested her. More importantly, she had never belonged in them. Yet, there she was, standing near the entrance with calm composure as though she had every right to be there. Gerald felt a strange mixture of surprise and irritation rise inside him. What was she doing here? Had she somehow received an invitation through one of the lower departments? Perhaps as administrative staff from some consulting firm? The thought settled quickly into something sharper. Embarrassment. Because if she was here in some minor role assistant coordinator support staff, it would make the entire situation uncomfortable. Several of Gerald's colleagues followed his gaze. "Who are you looking at?" one of them asked. Gerald hesitated briefly. Then he shrugged. No one important, but the curiosity had already taken hold. He watched as Noelle moved further into the ballroom. Her dress was elegant but simple. Dark blue understated the kind of design that drew attention through restraint rather than extravagance. She walked slowly, observing the room with quiet attentiveness. Exactly the way she used to observe things years ago. Gerald felt an old familiar irritation stir. That calm expression, that careful silence. It had always made him uneasy, even during their marriage. He turned back to his colleagues. "Excuse me," he said casually. "I'll be back." Carrying his champagne glass, Gerald crossed the ballroom. With each step, his confidence returned. Whatever Noelle was doing here, the situation was obvious. She had wandered into an environment she didn't understand. And Gerald Whitmore now stood firmly on the other side of that divide. Noelle noticed him approaching long before he reached her. She had seen Gerald almost the moment she entered the room. Not because she was searching for him, but because her habit of observation rarely missed familiar details. He looked exactly as she remembered, tall, confident, moving through the room with the easy assurance of someone convinced he belonged there. Their eyes met briefly. Gerald smiled. The expression was not warm. It carried the faint edge of amusement. "Well," he said, as he stopped a few feet away. "This is unexpected." Noelle remained calm. "Hello, Gerald." He glanced at her dress, then around the room, as though verifying the reality of what he was seeing. "I have to admit," he continued, "this isn't where I imagined running into you." His tone was light enough that nearby guests might mistake it for friendly conversation. But the implication was clear. Noelle understood it immediately. "I received an invitation," she said simply. Gerald raised an eyebrow. "An invitation, yes." He laughed softly. "That's interesting." Gerald took a sip of champagne, studying her more carefully. "I didn't realize they were inviting outside guests now." The pause before the last words carried unmistakable meaning. Several people nearby had begun to notice the exchange. Corporate events thrived on subtle drama. Gerald leaned slightly closer. "You know," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound confidential, "these events are usually reserved for people connected to the company." Noelle didn't respond immediately. She simply met his gaze. Gerald interpreted the silence as uncertainty. His confidence expanded. "So tell me," he continued with a faint smile, How exactly did you end up here? The question hung between them. Nearby, 2 employees from the marketing department had turned slightly to watch. Noelle's answer remained simple. I came with someone. Gerald laughed again. Of course you did. He glanced around the ballroom. Well, I hope whoever invited you understands what this event is. His voice carried just enough volume now that a few more people turned their heads. This isn't exactly a casual dinner. Noelle said nothing. Gerald mistook her quietness for discomfort, the same mistake he had made many times before. You always did have a habit of wandering into situations you didn't quite understand, he said lightly. Remember those networking dinners you hated? The comment drew a small chuckle from one of the nearby observers. Gerald felt encouraged. Corporate leadership events, he continued gesturing subtly around the room, tend to be selective. Noelle remained still, her expression unchanged. Gerald tilted his head slightly. Don't get me wrong, he added. I'm sure you meant well coming here. The words sounded polite, but the meaning underneath them sharpened. It's just that places like this usually expect a certain level of relevance. Someone behind Gerald shifted uncomfortably. The tension in the air had grown noticeable. But Gerald didn't stop. He had spent years convincing himself that Noelle represented a smaller chapter of his life. Seeing her here now, inside the very environment he had once claimed she didn't belong in, stirred something defensive inside him. And defense often disguised itself as superiority. So tell me, he said with a faint smile that no longer bothered hiding its edge. Who exactly did you come here with? For the first time, Noelle glanced past him, toward the far side of the ballroom. Gerald followed her gaze automatically, but he saw nothing unusual, just another group of guests arriving near the entrance. When he looked back at her, he decided to press further. You know, he said, his voice carrying just enough volume for several nearby listeners to hear clearly. Now, events like this can be a little awkward if someone shows up without understanding how things work. Noelle finally spoke again. Her voice was calm. I understand perfectly. Gerald chuckled. Do you? He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice once more. Because from where I'm standing, this looks a lot like someone trying to step into a room they were never meant to enter. The remark lingered in the air. A few conversations nearby had gone quiet. Gerald felt the strange thrill of attention. He had always been comfortable commanding a room, even through subtle humiliation. Noelle studied him for a moment, not with anger, not with embarrassment, simply with quiet observation. Then she took a single small step back. The movement created a subtle space between them. Gerald frowned slightly. What's that supposed to mean? He asked. Noelle didn't answer. Her eyes had shifted again toward the entrance, and this time someone else was walking toward them. Someone whose presence changed the atmosphere of the entire ballroom. Gerald hadn't noticed yet, but several others had, because Jonathan Reeves, CEO of Hellbrook Financial Group, had just entered the room. And he was walking directly toward Noelle Davenport. For a brief moment, the energy of the ballroom shifted. It was subtle at first. Not an announcement, not a dramatic entrance. Just the quiet ripple that always moved through a corporate gathering when someone with real authority stepped into the room. Jonathan Reeves walked in through the tall glass doors near the entrance, greeting a few senior staff members along the way with the calm nod of someone who had attended hundreds of events like this and never needed to demand attention to receive it. His presence carried its own gravity. Several executives straightened slightly as they noticed him. A few board members moved forward to shake his hand. The string quartet near the stage continued playing softly, but conversations in nearby clusters lowered in volume. Gerald Whitmore did not notice immediately. He was still focused on Noelle. From his perspective, the moment felt almost satisfying. A small demonstration of the distance between their lives now. You always did this, Gerald said with a soft laugh. Noelle looked at him calmly. What do you mean? Standing there quietly, like you understand everything he said. He gestured around the ballroom again. This world isn't built on quiet observation, Noelle. It's built on influence. A few people nearby were openly listening now. Gerald could feel their attention, and attention encouraged him. "You see those people over there?" He continued, nodding toward a group of senior managers. "They run divisions worth hundreds of millions." Then he gestured toward the front of the room. "And the executives up there, they decide where the entire company goes next." His smile widened slightly. People spend years earning a place in rooms like this. Noelle remained still. Her expression didn't change. Gerald tilted his head. "And yet, here you are," he said, "still pretending you belong." The remark hung in the air longer than Gerald expected, because something else had changed. The quiet ripple moving through the ballroom had reached the small circle around them. Several people were no longer looking at Gerald. They were looking behind him. Gerald noticed the shift a second later. He frowned slightly and turned. Jonathan Reeves was standing only a few steps away. Gerald's body stiffened. It took less than a second for recognition to register. Every employee at Hellbrook Financial knew Jonathan Reeves. Gerald straightened immediately. "Mr. Reeves," he said quickly, setting down a champagne glass on a nearby table. "I didn't realize you had arrived." Jonathan nodded politely. "Good evening, Gerald." His tone was calm, professional, but his eyes had already moved past Gerald. They rested on Noelle. The expression that appeared on Jonathan's face then was unmistakably warm. "Sorry," he said gently. "I was stopped at the door." Noelle gave a small nod. "I noticed." Gerald blinked. The exchange felt strange. Jonathan stepped closer. And then, in the simplest possible way, he placed a hand lightly at the small of Noelle's back. The gesture was natural, familiar, the kind of quiet intimacy that did not need explanation. Gerald felt the first flicker of confusion move through his chest. Jonathan looked back toward him. "Gerald," he said calmly, "have you met my wife?" The sentence landed in the air with the quiet weight of a falling stone. For a moment, Gerald simply stared. The words didn't process immediately. "My wife." He looked from Jonathan to Noelle, then back again. "Noelle Davenport," Jonathan continued gently. "My wife." The surrounding conversations in that part of the ballroom had gone completely silent. Several employees nearby stood frozen, their expressions caught somewhere between shock and fascination. Gerald's mind scrambled to reconstruct the last several minutes. Every word he had just spoken, every insinuation, every remark delivered with casual superiority. His mouth opened slightly, closed again. That's not," he began. But the sentence failed. Jonathan's expression remained calm. He was not angry, not confrontational. But the quiet authority in his posture made the situation unmistakable. Gerald felt heat rise to his face. "I didn't realize," he said quickly. "No," Jonathan replied. "I don't believe you did." The response carried no sarcasm, just a statement of fact. Gerald glanced briefly around the small crowd that had formed. He recognized several of them. Managers, directors, colleagues who had just watched the entire exchange unfold. The same people who had heard him imply that Noelle didn't belong here. Gerald forced a laugh that sounded thinner than he intended. "Well," he said awkwardly, "this is certainly unexpected." Jonathan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward Noelle. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. She had not raised it once during the entire exchange. Jonathan nodded. Then he turned back toward Gerald. "I'm glad we ran into each other," he said calmly. Gerald's stomach tightened. There was nothing openly hostile in Jonathan's tone. But something about the calmness made the moment even more uncomfortable. Jonathan gestured lightly toward the room. "It seems you and Noelle were already having a conversation." Gerald swallowed. "Yes." He hesitated, then added quickly, "I didn't realize who she was with." Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "That's understandable." Gerald felt a small flicker of relief. Maybe the situation could still be smoothed over. Corporate environments valued diplomacy. If he handled this carefully, perhaps the moment would pass. "I hope I didn't say anything inappropriate," Gerald said carefully. Jonathan's expression didn't change, but several people nearby shifted uncomfortably because they had heard exactly what Gerald said. Noelle remained silent. She simply observed. Jonathan studied Gerald for a moment. Then he spoke. "I think everyone here heard the conversation," he said calmly. The statement wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Gerald felt his chest tighten again. "Well," he said quickly, "clearly there's been some misunderstanding." Jonathan nodded slightly. Yes. The word carried a different meaning than Gerald intended. Another executive approached at that moment, greeting Jonathan and briefly interrupting the tension. The small circle around them loosened slightly as conversations resumed elsewhere in the room. But the atmosphere had changed. Everyone present now understood the same thing. Gerald Whitmore had just publicly mocked the wife of the company's CEO. Gerald attempted another smile. "I should probably get back to my table," he said. Jonathan inclined his head politely. "Of course." Gerald turned to leave, but just before he stepped away, Noelle spoke again. Her voice remained calm. "Gerald." He stopped. Slowly, he turned back. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no anger in her expression, no triumph, just the same quiet observation she had always carried. "I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening," she said. The sentence sounded polite, almost kind, but something about it made Gerald feel even smaller than the revelation itself, because it reminded him of something he had forgotten long ago. Noelle Davenport had never needed to raise her voice to make the truth visible. Gerald nodded stiffly. Then he walked away. Behind him, conversations gradually returned to normal across the ballroom. But the story of what had just happened was already moving through the room faster than any official announcement. Corporate environments thrived on information. And tonight, the most important information in the room had nothing to do with awards. It was the quiet collapse of a man's certainty. Meanwhile, Jonathan glanced at Noelle. "You handled that better than most people would have," he said softly. Noelle looked across the ballroom toward the table where Gerald had retreated. "He handled it exactly the way he always did," she replied. Jonathan followed her gaze. "What do you mean?" Noelle folded her hands calmly. He believed the room defined reality. Jonathan nodded slowly. "And tonight," Noelle looked back at him. "Tonight," she said quietly, "the room finally saw him clearly." But the evening was far from over, because the consequences of humiliation were only the beginning. The systems Jonathan Reeves believed in, the ones designed to reveal deeper truths, had not yet finished their work. And somewhere inside Hellbrook, Financial's internal records questions were already beginning to surface. Questions that had nothing to do with a ballroom, and everything to do with Gerald Whitmore. For the rest of the ballroom, the evening continued. Music played. Wine glasses clinked softly. Executives moved from table to table, exchanging polite greetings, congratulating award nominees, discussing market forecasts and next quarter's strategies. From a distance, nothing about the Hellbrook Financial Leadership Honor Gala appeared unusual. But in one corner of the room, a subtle shift had already taken hold. Information moved quickly in professional environments, faster than announcements, faster than formal emails. Within 15 minutes, a quiet version of the story had already traveled across several tables. Gerald Whitmore publicly mocked a woman. Turned out she was Jonathan Reeves' wife. The facts spread quietly, but the effect was unmistakable. People began looking at Gerald differently, not openly. Corporate etiquette rarely allowed open confrontation. But glances lingered longer. Conversations paused when he approached. And Gerald noticed. He sat at his assigned table, barely hearing the light conversation around him. The glass of wine in his hand remained untouched. Across the ballroom, Jonathan Reeves had taken his seat at the executive table near the stage. Noelle sat beside him. The position itself was explanation enough for anyone who still had questions. Several senior staff members stopped by the table to greet Jonathan during the break before dinner service began. Each of them acknowledged Noelle politely, not with exaggerated attention, but with respectful curiosity. Noelle answered calmly when spoken to. She did not elaborate on anything that had happened earlier. She did not mention Gerald's remarks. She simply behaved the same way she always had. Quiet, observant, composed. Jonathan noticed. "You're very calm," he said quietly. Noelle glanced toward the far side of the ballroom where Gerald sat. "He hasn't changed," she replied. Jonathan followed her gaze. "Do you think he understands what just happened?" Noelle considered the question. "Yes," she said, "but not the part that matters." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "What part is that?" Noelle looked back toward the stage, the part where the room is only the beginning. Jonathan studied her expression. He knew she rarely spoke in vague terms. "What do you mean?" he asked. Noelle didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her small evening bag and removed a thin folder. Jonathan recognized the careful way she handled documents. "These are copies," she said quietly. Jonathan took the folder. Inside were printed pages, bank statements, email chains, expense confirmations. Each page was marked with notes in Noelle's precise handwriting. Jonathan read silently for a moment, then he looked up. "This involves Gerald," he said. "Yes." Jonathan continued reading. Several entries related to internal reimbursement records from Hellbrook Financial. Dates, project budgets, personal transfers that overlapped suspiciously with corporate expenses. None of it proved fraud immediately. But the patterns were unmistakable. Jonathan closed the folder slowly. "How long have you had these?" he asked. "Years," Noelle replied. Jonathan looked surprised. "You never mentioned them." "I wasn't sure they mattered," she said. "You do now?" "Yes." Jonathan leaned slightly closer. What changed? Noelle's voice remained calm. Timing, Jonathan understood. He glanced across the ballroom again toward Gerald's table. "Do you think these relate to company funds?" he asked. "I think they might," Noelle said. Jonathan considered the implications carefully. At Hellbrook, financial allegations of financial misconduct were taken seriously. But procedures mattered. Evidence mattered. Accusations without documentation were useless. What Noelle had collected was not an accusation. It was information, quietly preserved. Jonathan looked at her again. "You didn't bring these tonight for revenge," he said. "No." "For closure, no." Then why? Noelle folded her hands. "Because if the company systems are working correctly, someone will eventually ask questions." Jonathan nodded slowly. "And you want those questions to have answers?" "Yes." Jonathan glanced toward the compliance director seated 2 tables away. "May I?" he asked. Noelle nodded once. Jonathan stood and walked quietly across the room. Several executives greeted him as he passed. He stopped beside David Langford, Hellbrook Financial's head of internal compliance. "David," Jonathan said quietly. Langford looked up. "Jonathan, do you have a moment?" Langford nodded and followed him toward a quieter area near the side hallway. Jonathan handed him the folder. "These documents came from someone I trust," he said. Langford opened the folder. Within seconds, his professional instincts activated. He flipped through several pages, then several more. His expression became serious. "These are internal references," Langford said. "Yes." Langford continued scanning the documents. "I'll need to verify them." "Of course." Langford closed the folder. "Who provided this?" Jonathan answered simply. "My wife." Langford nodded once. He had already heard the earlier whispers moving through the ballroom. But this conversation had nothing to do with social embarrassment. This was procedural. "I'll start a preliminary review first thing tomorrow," Langford said. Jonathan shook his head slightly. "Tonight." Langford studied him. Why the urgency? Jonathan gestured subtly toward the ballroom. "Because the individual connected to these records is in this room." Langford's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who?" Jonathan replied calmly. "Gerald Whitmore." Langford said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded. "I'll assemble the audit team." Meanwhile, across the ballroom, Gerald sat quietly as dinner service began. The earlier energy of the evening had drained from him. His mind replayed the moment again and again. Jonathan Reeves standing beside Noelle, introducing her as his wife. The looks on people's faces, the sudden silence. Gerald forced himself to breathe slowly. This could still be managed. Embarrassing moments happened in corporate environments all the time. People forgot things. Reputations recovered. He just needed to remain composed. The award ceremony would begin soon. Once his name was announced, attention would shift. Recognition would reestablish his standing. Yes, that was what would happen. Gerald lifted his wine glass and took a long drink. Across the ballroom, Noelle watched him quietly. Jonathan returned to the table. "It's in motion," he said softly. Noelle nodded. She did not look satisfied. She did not look relieved. She simply looked thoughtful. Because the humiliation Gerald experienced earlier that evening was never the real turning point. It was only the first visible crack. The deeper consequences were already unfolding. Quietly, systematically, exactly the way truth always did. Dinner at the Hellbrook Financial Leadership Honor Gala proceeded with the polished efficiency expected of events where executives and investors shared the same room. Waiters moved quietly between tables. Courses were served in careful sequence. Speeches were scheduled to begin shortly after the main course. To an outsider, the evening still looked perfectly controlled. But beneath the surface, two very different processes were unfolding. At the executive table, Jonathan Reeves listened politely as a board member discussed market expansion strategies. His responses were calm and measured as always. But part of his attention remained elsewhere, across the ballroom, and inside the quiet chain of messages now moving through Hellbrook Financial's internal compliance system. When David Langford returned to his table after speaking with Jonathan, he had already begun sending discreet instructions. 2 members of the internal audit team had been contacted. A secure access request had been opened for the financial records referenced in the folder. Hellbrook Financial had spent years building systems designed precisely for moments like this. Quiet verification, immediate cross-checking, no public accusations, only data. Meanwhile, Gerald Whitmore tried to restore his composure. The initial shock of the earlier encounter had faded slightly, replaced by a stubborn determination not to let the evening unravel his confidence. He straightened his tie, joined a conversation about investment performance, even forced a small laugh when someone made a light remark about the wine selection. But his awareness of the room had changed. He felt it in the pauses between words, in the way certain colleagues avoided undirect eye contact, in the subtle distance that appeared whenever he approached a group conversation. Gerald told himself it was temporary. People loved gossip. But they also forgot quickly. Once the awards ceremony began, attention would shift. Recognition would return. Across the ballroom, Noelle watched the room with the same quiet awareness she had carried for years. Jonathan leaned slightly closer to her. "Langford has already started reviewing the records," he said. Noelle nodded. Her gaze moved slowly across the tables. "You built a system designed to notice patterns," she said. Jonathan smiled faintly. "Yes." "And when the pattern appears," she asked, "we verify it. And then we follow the evidence." Noelle folded her hands calmly. "That's all that's happening tonight." Jonathan studied her for a moment. "You've waited a long time to say anything about those records." "Yes." Why now? Noelle looked toward the stage where the event host was preparing to begin the award presentations. "Because systems only work when the right people are watching," she said. Jonathan understood immediately. For years, the documents she had kept were simply fragments, pieces without context. But now, those fragments intersected with something larger. The financial oversight structures inside Hellbrook Financial. the same systems Jonathan had strengthened over the last decade. At the far side of the ballroom, Gerald's phone vibrated quietly against the table. He glanced down. The notification came from an internal company messaging system. It was unusual. Internal messages rarely appeared during events like this. Gerald opened it. The sender was someone from the financial compliance department. The message was short. "Mr. Whitmore, when convenient this evening, please contact compliance regarding a routine verification of several expense records associated with Project Horizon." Gerald frowned. Routine verification. The wording felt neutral, almost casual, but something about the timing unsettled him. He typed a quick reply. "Currently attending the gala. Can this wait until tomorrow morning?" The response appeared only seconds later. "It would be preferable to speak tonight." Gerald stared at the screen. A faint uneasiness began forming in the back of his mind. Across the room, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host said warmly, "thank you all for joining us tonight for Hellbrook Financial's annual Leadership Honor Gala." Applause spread across the ballroom. Gerald placed his phone back on the table. Whatever compliance wanted it could wait. This was his moment. The host continued speaking, describing the company's performance over the past year, highlighting several major initiatives that had expanded Hellbrook Financial's market reach. One by one, award categories were announced. Teams were recognized. Managers stepped forward to accept plaques and brief rounds of applause. Gerald felt his focus returning. Soon they would reach his category. Across the ballroom, Jonathan noticed something. Two members of the compliance team had entered the room quietly and taken seats near the back. David Langford spoke briefly with them before handing over several printed documents. The process remained invisible to most of the guests, but Jonathan knew exactly what it meant. The verification had begun. On stage, the host continued. "And now," he said, "we move to one of the most important recognitions of the evening." Gerald's heart lifted slightly. This award honors leadership and strategic project execution individuals who have demonstrated exceptional initiative and measurable results over the past fiscal year. Gerald adjusted his posture. The room felt suddenly brighter. The host opened an envelope, and this year's recipient of the Outstanding Strategic Project Leadership Award is... A brief pause. Gerald Whitmore. Applause filled the ballroom. Gerald stood. Relief and pride surged through him at the same time. He straightened his jacket and walked confidently toward the stage. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Recognition, applause, the environment where he believed he belonged. As he reached the stage, the host handed him the award plaque. "Congratulations," the man said quietly. Gerald smiled and turned toward the microphone. The applause faded. He cleared his throat. "Thank you," he began. "It's an honor to be recognized among so many talented colleagues." But before he could continue, a small movement near the back of the ballroom drew the attention of several people. Two members of Hellbrook Financial's compliance team were approaching the stage. They did not rush. They walked calmly, professionally. But their presence during an award speech was unusual enough that conversations near the back of the room had already begun to quiet. Gerald noticed them a moment later. His words slowed, and "I'd like to think," he stopped. The two compliance officers had reached the base of the stage. David Langford followed a few steps behind them. The room had grown noticeably quieter now. Langford looked up toward the stage. His voice was calm. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "we need to speak with you regarding several financial records requiring immediate clarification." The sentence carried no accusation, but the timing spoke louder than any announcement. Gerald felt the blood drain from his face. Hundreds of eyes were suddenly watching. The award plaque felt heavier in his hands. Across the ballroom, Noelle remained seated beside Jonathan. She did not smile. She did not look triumphant. She simply observed the moment the way she had always observed everything else. carefully, quietly. Because the real story was no longer about humiliation. It was about documentation, records, systems, and the quiet power of truth when it finally stepped into the light. The silence in the ballroom stretched longer than anyone expected. Gerald Whitmore stood frozen on the stage, the award plaque still in his hands, the microphone in front of him, capturing the faint sound of his breathing. For a few seconds, no one moved. The audience seemed to hold its collective breath. Corporate events followed scripts, speeches, applause, photographs, polite laughter. What was happening now did not belong to that script. David Langford remained standing near the foot of the stage with the two compliance officers beside him. His tone had been calm, but the words carried unmistakable weight. "Mr. Whitmore, we need to speak with you regarding several financial records requiring immediate clarification." Gerald forced a small smile, the kind used in corporate settings to smooth over awkward moments. "I'm sure this can wait until after the ceremony," he said into the microphone, his voice sounding thinner than usual. A few polite chuckles came from scattered tables. Gerald leaned slightly toward Langford. "David," he said, lowering his voice just enough to suggest familiarity, "we can discuss whatever this is tomorrow morning." Langford's expression remained professional. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," he replied. The quiet firmness of the answer sent another ripple through the room. Gerald felt the tension tighten inside his chest. "This is an internal compliance matter," Langford continued. "It requires your attention now." On stage, the event host looked uncertain. He stepped closer to Gerald, whispering something meant for privacy. But the microphone caught fragments of the exchange. "Maybe step aside. Handle this quietly." Gerald nodded stiffly. The applause that had filled the room only moments earlier now felt like a distant memory. He stepped away from the microphone and walked toward the side stairs of the stage. The compliance officers moved slightly to meet him. As Gerald descended the steps, hundreds of eyes followed. Corporate etiquette prevented open commentary, but the atmosphere in the ballroom had transformed completely. At the executive table, Jonathan Reeves remained seated. His expression was calm, but his attention was focused. Beside him, Noelle Davenport watched quietly. Jonathan leaned slightly toward her. "This will move quickly now," he said. Noelle nodded. Systems are efficient when the documentation is clear. Across the room, Gerald had reached the side hallway where Langford waited with a small folder in his hand. The music from the ballroom sounded distant now, muted by thick hotel walls. Gerald turned sharply. "What is this about?" he demanded. Langford opened the folder. Several pages were clipped together. "These records relate to expense reimbursements and project fund transfers associated with the Horizon Initiative." Gerald frowned. "That project closed 6 months ago." "Yes," Langford said calmly. "That's when the irregularities began appearing in the system." Gerald felt irritation replace the earlier embarrassment. "I filed every report required for that project." Langford nodded. "We know." Gerald crossed his arms. "So what exactly is the problem?" Langford turned the folder so Gerald could see. "These transactions." Gerald glanced down. Several bank transfer records, expense reports, approval signatures. At first glance, everything looked familiar. Then he noticed something else. The annotations. Each page contained small notes highlighting dates and cross-references. Gerald's stomach tightened. "Where did you get these?" he asked. Langford didn't answer directly. They were provided as part of a documentation review. Gerald looked up sharply. A review by who Langford met his eyes. By someone with access to historical records connected to these transactions. Gerald's mind raced. The dates on the documents stretched back years. Some even overlapped with the final months of his marriage. A memory flickered uncomfortably. Noelle organizing financial papers at the kitchen table. Noelle quietly saving email confirmations. Noelle reviewing bank statements late at night. Gerald pushed the thought away. "This proves nothing," he said quickly. Langford remained calm. It raises questions. Gerald pointed at one of the pages. That transfer was part of a reimbursement adjustment. Langford flipped to another document. And this one, Gerald hesitated. That was a temporary holding transfer. Langford nodded. That's what the original report states. He turned another page, but the routing numbers indicate the funds moved through a personal account before returning to the project ledger. Gerald felt his pulse quicken. That's a misunderstanding of how the reimbursement process worked. Langford's expression didn't change. That's exactly what we're here to clarify. Gerald ran a hand through his hair. Look, he said, lowering his voice. We can resolve this tomorrow with proper documentation. Langford closed the folder. The documentation is what brought us here. Gerald stared at him. Langford continued calmly. Multiple transactions connected to your department show patterns of delayed reimbursement, followed by personal account transfers. Gerald's voice rose slightly. That doesn't mean anything illegal happened. We haven't said that it did, Langford replied. But the pattern requires explanation. Gerald felt the weight of the evening pressing in on him from every direction. Only 20 minutes earlier, he had been standing on a stage receiving an award. Now he was in a quiet hallway, answering questions about financial records. How did this even start? He asked. Langford answered honestly. Someone provided historical documentation that matched anomalies already flagged by our internal systems. Gerald's mind snapped to one person immediately. Noelle, he muttered. Langford didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. Gerald's jaw tightened. She had no right to interfere in company business. Langford's voice remained measured. She didn't interfere. He tapped the folder lightly. She preserved records. The word struck harder than Gerald expected. For years, he had dismissed Noelle's habits as unnecessary caution. Her quiet organization, her insistence on keeping copies of everything. Now those same habits were sitting inside a compliance file. Langford continued, "This is still a preliminary inquiry." Gerald seized on the phrase. "So nothing has been proven? Not yet." "Then why humiliate me in front of the entire company?" Langford's expression remained steady. "We didn't choose the timing." Gerald laughed bitterly. "You could have waited." Langford shook his head slightly. Once the documentation was verified, the process required immediate review. Gerald looked back toward the ballroom doors. He could still hear distant applause from another award being announced. For the first time that evening, the reality of his situation began to settle in. This was no longer about a social embarrassment. This was about records, transactions, systems designed to detect patterns he had assumed no one would ever connect. Gerald turned back to Langford. "What happens now?" Langford answered calmly. "Tonight, we collect your explanation. And after that, the audit team will review every transaction connected to the Horizon Initiative." Gerald felt the room tilt slightly around him. And if they don't like what they find, Langford held his gaze. Then the process moves beyond internal review. Gerald understood the implication immediately. Legal investigation, regulatory involvement, the kind of scrutiny that ended careers. Inside the ballroom, the music continued. The gala moved forward. But for Gerald Whitmore, the evening had already changed permanently. And across the room, seated quietly beside Jonathan Reeves, Noelle Davenport remained exactly as she had always been. Silent, observant, and patient enough to let the truth unfold on its own. The hallway outside the ballroom felt strangely quiet compared to the bright noise of the gala inside. Gerald Whitmore stood with his back against the wall, his shoulders tense as David Langford finished organizing the documents back into the folder. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. Through the closed ballroom doors came distant applause, followed by the muffled voice of the event host announcing another award. The gala was continuing. The company's celebration of leadership and achievement had not paused. But Gerald's evening had already diverged from that reality. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" Gerald finally asked. Langford's expression remained calm. "We're not accusing you of anything yet. Gerald gave a short, humorless laugh. You interrupted an award ceremony in front of hundreds of people. Yes, Langford replied, because the documentation required immediate clarification. Gerald pushed himself away from the wall. Documentation from my ex-wife. Langford said nothing. Gerald took that silence as confirmation. She had no right to dig into company records, he said sharply. She didn't, Langford replied. Gerald frowned. What do you mean? Langford tapped the folder. The documents she provided were personal copies of financial records from your shared accounts and email correspondence. Gerald's stomach tightened again. She kept those, yes. Gerald looked away. Years earlier during their marriage, he had barely noticed how often Noelle organized files, downloaded statements, or printed confirmation emails. At the time, it seemed harmless. Now those quiet habits had turned into a paper trail. Langford continued calmly. Our internal systems had already flagged irregularities related to the Horizon Initiative accounts. Gerald turned back quickly. What irregularities? Langford flipped open the folder again and showed him a page. These reimbursement delays. Gerald scanned the numbers. They were timing issues. Langford nodded. That's what the report said. He turned another page. But when we cross-referenced those delays with personal account activity, the pattern became more complicated. Gerald's jaw tightened. You're looking at incomplete information. That's why we're speaking with you. Langford's tone remained professional. We want your explanation. Gerald ran a hand across his face. Fine, he said. That transfer there, he pointed to one of the highlighted transactions, was a short-term holding transfer while reimbursement paperwork processed. Langford listened. And the routing through your personal account, it was temporary. Langford nodded slowly. And the 3 similar transactions after that, Gerald hesitated. They were administrative adjustments. Langford made a small note. What about the email correspondence? Gerald looked up sharply. What email correspondence? Langford turned another page. Printed copies of emails appeared. Messages Gerald had sent years earlier. Some to project partners, some to internal accounting. And one message sent from his personal account to an outside vendor. Gerald felt the air leave his lungs. How did you get that? He asked. Langford met his gaze. It was included with the documentation we received. Gerald's mind raced again. Noelle. She had saved everything, even emails he had long forgotten. Langford closed the folder once more. This is why we need a full audit. Gerald shook his head. You're blowing this completely out of proportion. Langford's voice remained steady. If the records confirm your explanation, the audit will close quickly. And if they don't, Langford didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, that depends on what the records show. Gerald looked back toward the ballroom doors again. Music drifted faintly through the hallway. The ceremony was continuing without him. What happens to my position during this audit? He asked. Langford spoke carefully. For the moment, your responsibilities will be temporarily reassigned. Gerald felt anger rising now. You're suspending me. Administrative leave during investigation is standard procedure. Gerald stared at him. This is because of her. Langford didn't respond. Gerald continued bitterly. She waited years to do this. Langford finally spoke again. From what I can see, she didn't initiate the investigation. Gerald frowned. What do you mean? Langford explained calmly. Our compliance system flagged several financial inconsistencies months ago. Gerald's eyes widened slightly. Months yet? Langford nodded. The documentation she provided simply accelerated the review. The words landed heavily. Gerald had assumed the situation began tonight. But the reality was worse. The system had already been watching. Noelle had only provided the missing pieces, Langford continued. You should also understand something important. Gerald looked at him. The company treats financial irregularities very seriously. I know that. Then you also know the process doesn't stop halfway. Gerald looked down at the floor. For the first time since the confrontation began, he felt something deeper than embarrassment. Fear. Meanwhile, inside the ballroom, the awards ceremony was nearing its final categories. Jonathan Reeves remained seated at the executive table. Several board members had noticed Gerald's absence, but no one had asked questions directly. Corporate leadership understood when certain matters required discretion. Noelle sat beside Jonathan, her posture calm. She had barely moved since the compliance team left the room earlier. Jonathan leaned slightly closer. "They'll begin the full audit tonight," he said quietly. Noelle nodded. "That's how your system works." Jonathan studied her expression. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not. Did you expect this outcome, no?" She paused. "I expected the process." Jonathan understood the distinction. Noelle had not tried to control the result. She had simply preserved the information. The system itself would decide the rest. At the far end of the ballroom, David Langford re-entered through the side doors. Several executives noticed his return, but he walked quietly to his seat without drawing attention. Jonathan glanced briefly in his direction. Langford gave a small nod. The investigation was officially underway. The gala concluded an hour later with final remarks from the board chairman. Applause filled the room. Guests began gathering their coats and exchanging final conversations before leaving. But one person did not return to the ballroom. Gerald Whitmore remained in a small conference room down the hallway where compliance officers continued reviewing documents. The award plaque he had received earlier sat untouched on the table beside him, a symbol of recognition that had already lost its meaning. Inside the ballroom, Noelle and Jonathan stood as guests began departing. Jonathan placed a hand lightly at her back. "Are you ready to go?" he asked. "Yes." They walked slowly toward the exit. Near the door, several employees greeted Jonathan politely. Some of them glanced at Noelle with curiosity. None of them mentioned Gerald. But the story of the evening had already spread. Outside the hotel, the winter air felt colder than before. The city lights reflected across the street as cars moved slowly through downtown traffic. Jonathan opened the car door for Noelle. Before getting in, she paused for a moment and looked back at the hotel. The ballroom windows glowed high above the street. Inside, the company's celebration of success was ending. But another process had just begun. One built not on applause or recognition, but on records, systems, and the quiet patience of truth waiting to be acknowledged. Noelle finally stepped into the car. Jonathan followed. As the driver pulled away from the curb, the Grand Meridian Hotel faded slowly into the distance. Behind them, the investigation into Gerald Whitmore's actions was already moving forward. And unlike the brief humiliation of the ballroom, this process would not end in a single evening. It would continue until every question had an answer. The morning after the Gala, Hellbrook Financial Group returned to its normal rhythm. Elevators carried employees up the glass tower floors in steady waves. Coffee machines hummed in break areas. Emails moved across internal networks with their usual quiet urgency. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. But within several departments, particularly compliance, internal audit, and legal, there was a clear shift in activity. Files were being opened, records reviewed, questions documented. Inside a conference room on the 27th floor, David Langford sat with two members of the internal audit team and a representative from corporate legal. On the large screen in front of them were spreadsheets pulled directly from Hellbrook Financial's transaction systems. Dozens of rows of numbers, dates, transfer confirmations, project codes. One of the auditors pointed at the screen. "These are the Horizon Initiative reimbursements." Langford nodded, and the personal account routing, confirmed the auditor replied. Another analyst added, "It happened multiple times." Langford leaned back in his chair. How many? The analyst checked the document. 7 transactions over 18 months. The legal representative spoke next. "Were the funds returned?" "Yes," the auditor said, "but not immediately." "How long were they held?" The analyst scrolled further down, in some cases several weeks. Langford folded his arms. So technically the project ledger was balanced later. Yes, but during those weeks, the money moved through Whitmore's personal account. The legal representative tapped the table lightly. That's a serious violation of financial protocol. Langford nodded. Yes, but we still need to confirm intent. Intent mattered. Corporate policy violations could lead to termination. But proving misuse of company funds could lead to something much more serious. Across the building, Gerald Whitmore sat alone in a temporary office assigned for the investigation. His badge had been temporarily restricted the night before. He could access only the areas necessary for the audit process. The sudden change felt surreal. Just 12 hours earlier, he had been standing on stage, receiving an award. Now he was waiting to answer questions about transactions he barely remembered. Gerald rubbed his temples. He had spent most of the night replaying the past. The Horizon Initiative, a large project with multiple financial adjustments, budget reallocations, vendor delays. There had been moments when cash flow timing became complicated. Short-term adjustments had seemed harmless, temporary. No one had complained. No one had noticed. At least that was what he had believed. Now the details were returning. Those brief transfers. The assumption that reimbursements would arrive quickly. The casual confidence that small procedural shortcuts would never matter. Gerald looked at the folders sitting on the desk. Copies of the same documents Langford had shown him. And behind those records, one unmistakable realization. Noelle had saved everything. Back in the compliance conference room, the review continued. Langford spoke again. Cross-referenced the transaction dates with Whitmore's authorization privileges. The analyst typed quickly. Confirmed, she said a moment later. He approved several of the transfers himself. The legal representative frowned slightly. That complicates things. Langford nodded. And the email chain, another screen opened. A message Gerald had sent to a project vendor appeared. The wording wasn't openly incriminating, but it referenced temporary routing of funds before formal reimbursement. The legal representative sighed quietly. That's enough to justify a formal inquiry. Langford closed his notebook. Then we move forward. The next step was inevitable. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Noelle Davenport sat at the small desk in Jonathan Reeves's home office. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of pages turning. Noelle was reviewing a book on financial ethics, the same steady routine she followed most mornings. Jonathan entered the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. You're working already, he said. Noelle looked up. I was reading. Jonathan handed her a cup. Langford sent me an update. Noelle waited. The audit confirmed 7 questionable transfers. She nodded slowly. That matches what I found. Jonathan leaned against the desk. They're opening a formal internal inquiry. Noelle sipped her coffee. That's the appropriate step. Jonathan studied her expression. You don't seem relieved. No. Why not Noelle place the cup down? Because this was never about proving him wrong. Jonathan understood. It's about the system working. Yes. Jonathan walked to the window. The lake stretched wide and silver beneath the morning sky. Gerald's career is probably over, he said quietly. Noelle didn't answer. Jonathan turned back. You don't feel any satisfaction? She thought for a moment. No, not even a little no. Jonathan looked curious. Why Noelle folded her hands calmly. Because humiliation doesn't correct behavior. Jonathan nodded slowly. What does accountability? Later that afternoon, Gerald was called back into the compliance conference room. Langford sat at the head of the table. The legal representative and 2 auditors were present. Gerald took his seat. Langford spoke first. Mr. Whitmore, thank you for returning. Gerald nodded stiffly. Langford opened a document. Our review has confirmed multiple financial transactions that moved project funds through your personal account before returning them to the company ledger. Gerald leaned forward. As I explained last night, those were temporary adjustments. The legal representative spoke calmly. Company policy strictly prohibits routing corporate funds through personal accounts. Gerald spread his hands. The money was returned. Yes, Langford said, but that does not eliminate the violation. Gerald's voice sharpened slightly. So what are you saying? Langford closed the file. We are initiating a formal internal disciplinary process. Gerald felt the words like a physical weight, and during that process he asked, your employment status will remain suspended. Gerald stared at the table. The room felt suddenly smaller. What happens after the investigation? He asked quietly. Langford answered honestly. That depends on the full findings. Gerald knew what that meant. Termination was almost certain. Legal consequences were possible. He looked up again. This started because of my ex-wife. Langford shook his head. No. Gerald frowned. Yes, it did. Langford met his eyes. This started because the records existed. Gerald said nothing. Langford continued. She didn't create the pattern. He tapped the file gently. You did. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Gerald left the room, slowly carrying none of the confidence he had walked into the gala with the night before. Across the city, Noelle closed her book and stepped outside onto the balcony. The wind from the lake was cool and steady. Far below, the city moved through another ordinary afternoon. Inside Hellbrook Financial's offices, the investigation would continue for weeks. But the outcome had already begun forming, not through anger, not through revenge, but through something much quieter. Records, patience, and the simple fact that truth once documented rarely disappears. The weeks following the gala passed with a steady, deliberate pace. Inside Hellbrook Financial Group, the investigation into Gerald Whitmore's financial conduct moved through its formal stages. Every document was reviewed. Every transaction was verified. Every email thread connected to the Horizon Initiative was examined with the careful patience of professionals whose job was not to assume, but to confirm. Compliance teams worked quietly. Auditors built timelines. Legal advisors evaluated the implications of each discovery. The company did not rush. In large institutions, haste could destroy credibility. Instead, they allowed the process to unfold methodically. 7 questionable transfers had been identified on the first review. By the second week, that number had grown to 11. Not all of them involved the same amounts. Some were small enough that they might have gone unnoticed if the internal systems had not been designed to track patterns rather than single events. What mattered was the method. Project funds routed temporarily through Gerald's personal account before returning to company records. Sometimes days later, sometimes weeks. The amounts varied, but the pattern remained consistent. Each instance violated company policy. And the email trail revealed something else. Gerald had known the rules. Inside the compliance office, David Langford closed the final report draft and leaned back in his chair. Across the table, the legal advisor reviewed the same document. Intent is difficult to prove, the advisor said. Langford nodded. Yes, but the policy violation is undeniable. That's enough for termination. Langford agreed. And if regulators review the case, the legal advisor considered the question carefully. They'll focus on whether the company funds were misused for personal gain. Langford looked at the report again. So far, the evidence suggests temporary holding rather than direct theft. That distinction may matter legally, the advisor said. But it won't save his position here. Langford closed the file. Then we proceed. Across town, Gerald Whitmore sat in a quiet apartment that felt smaller than he remembered. His administrative leave had become permanent suspension pending final review. His access to company systems had been removed. Former colleagues had stopped calling. Even the few professional contacts who still answered his messages sounded cautious. Corporate environments could be unforgiving once a reputation fractured. Gerald spent most days reviewing the same memories again and again. The gala. Noelle standing calmly across the ballroom. Jonathan Reeves introducing her as his wife. And then the compliance officers walking toward the stage. The moment when applause turned into silence. At night, he replayed older memories too. Noelle organizing paperwork at the kitchen table. Noelle printing financial confirmations. Noelle quietly storing folders in cabinets. He had always dismissed those habits as unnecessary, overly cautious. Now, those same habits had become the foundation of an investigation. Gerald stared at the unopened award plaque sitting on his coffee table. The engraved medal still read, "Outstanding Strategic Project Leadership, Gerald Whitmore." The recognition now felt almost absurd. Meanwhile, several miles away, Noelle Davenport continued her life without dramatic change. Her days followed the same steady rhythm: morning reading, work projects, evening walks along the lake. Jonathan occasionally updated her on the progress of the investigation, but she never asked for details beyond what was necessary. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after the gala, Jonathan returned home later than usual. Noelle was sitting in the living room reading when he entered. "It's finished," he said. Noelle looked up. "The investigation, yes." Jonathan removed his coat and sat beside her. "The board approved the final recommendation this afternoon." Noelle waited quietly. "Gerald's employment has been terminated." She nodded once. "And the legal review?" Jonathan folded his hands. "Regulators may still examine the case, but the company has reported everything fully." Noelle absorbed the information calmly. Jonathan studied her expression again. "You still don't look relieved," he said. "No." Jonathan leaned back. "Most people would feel vindicated." Noelle closed her book. "Vindication suggests competition." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "And this wasn't no." She paused. "It was correction." Jonathan thought about that word. Correction. Systems correcting themselves. Processes revealing patterns that individuals might ignore. "You never once tried to confront him directly," Jonathan said. "No." "Even after the gala?" "No." Jonathan asked the question he had been wondering about since that night. Why Noelle looked out toward the dark water beyond the windows. Because confrontation rarely changes behavior. And documentation does, yes. Jonathan nodded slowly. In the corporate world he had spent decades managing, that statement was painfully accurate. The following day, Hellbrook Financial issued a quiet internal memo. It did not mention details. It simply announced that Gerald Whitmore was no longer employed by the company following a review of financial policy violations. No drama, no public scandal, just a formal conclusion. Inside the organization, people understood the message clearly. Policies existed for a reason. Systems existed to enforce them. And documentation, once preserved, carried a power that status could not erase. Weeks later, the Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom had already hosted several other events. Corporate celebrations moved quickly from one occasion to another. But for those who had attended the Hellbrook Financial Gala, the memory lingered. Not because of the awards, but because of the moment when arrogance met quiet truth. One afternoon, Jonathan and Noelle walked together along the lakeshore path. Winter was slowly fading. The first hints of spring air moved across the water. Jonathan stopped beside the railing overlooking the lake. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "most people in my position would have handled that situation differently." Noelle glanced at him. "How?" angered Jonathan said. "Public consequences." "No." Why not? Noelle rested her hands lightly on the railing. "Because humiliation doesn't build better systems." Jonathan smiled faintly. "You keep coming back to systems." "Yes." "Why?" She looked across the wide gray water. "Because systems remember what people try to forget." Jonathan nodded. The wind moved gently across the lake. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jonathan said quietly, "You closed that chapter with more dignity than most people would have." Noelle's expression remained calm. It was already closed. Jonathan looked at her. Then what was the gala? Noelle thought for a moment. "A reminder," she said, "of what that truth doesn't need to raise its voice." She turned away from the water. Eventually it's heard anyway. Spring arrived in Chicago quietly. The last traces of winter melted from the sidewalks. Trees along the lakefront began showing the first hints of green. Morning sunlight lingered longer on the water, stretching across Lake Michigan in soft reflections that changed color with every passing hour. Life, as it always did, continued moving forward. For Noelle Davenport, that movement did not feel dramatic. It felt natural. Several months had passed since the night of the Hellbrook Financial Leadership Honor Gala. The story of that evening had gradually faded from office conversations, replaced by the constant cycle of new projects, quarterly reports, and corporate decisions. Inside Hellbrook, financial policies had been quietly updated. Additional safeguards were introduced into the reimbursement approval system. Several departments adopted stricter financial verification procedures. Most employees did not know the full history behind those changes, but the systems had learned from the event. And that was enough. Jonathan Reeves had once told his executive team that the purpose of accountability was not punishment, it was correction. Now the company reflected that belief. Across the city, Gerald Whitmore's life had taken a very different direction. After the investigation concluded, his termination had been followed by several difficult weeks. Recruiters stopped returning calls once they learned the circumstances of his departure. Professional references became hesitant. Some former colleagues avoided responding entirely. Corporate reputation traveled quickly through industry networks. Gerald spent long afternoons in his apartment reviewing job listings, rewriting his resume, and trying to reconstruct a version of his career that would survive scrutiny. But even he understood something had shifted permanently. The reputation he once believed unbreakable had fractured. Not in a single dramatic moment, but through a slow accumulation of facts, records, emails, transactions that refused to disappear once examined. In quieter moments, Gerald sometimes thought about the final conversation he had with David Langford. She didn't create the pattern. You did. At the time, the words had felt accusatory. Now, they felt unavoidable. Gerald had always believed success was built through confidence, persuasion, and the ability to control how others perceived him. What he had underestimated was the quiet persistence of documentation, the small details he once dismissed, the records he assumed no one would ever connect, and the woman who had quietly preserved them without raising her voice. Meanwhile, Noelle's life had continued with the same steady structure she had always preferred. Her mornings began early: coffee, reading, a brief walk along the lakeshore path before the city's traffic filled the streets. Jonathan often joined her when his schedule allowed. Their conversations remained calm, thoughtful, sometimes philosophical in the way two observant people often became when walking beside open water. One afternoon in late April, they stopped near the same railing where they had stood weeks earlier. The lake stretched wide beneath a clear sky. Boats moved slowly in the distance. Jonathan leaned his arms against the railing. "Langford sent me a final report this morning," he said. Noelle turned slightly. "The regulatory review is complete?" "Yes, and no further action." Noelle nodded. The investigation had already determined that the company funds were eventually returned, though the policy violations had been serious enough to end Gerald's career at Hellbrook Financial. Jonathan studied her expression again. "You really don't feel anything about it?" he asked. Noelle smiled slightly. "I feel something." "What?" She thought for a moment. Distance. Jonathan nodded slowly. That might be the healthiest outcome. Noelle watched the lake quietly. People often believe justice means watching someone fall. Jonathan looked at her. "And you don't know?" "Why not?" she answered calmly. "Because falling isn't the point." Jonathan waited. "The point," she continued, "is that the truth eventually stands on its own." The wind moved across the water again. Jonathan smiled faintly. "You know, he said most corporate scandals involve people shouting accusations at each other." Noelle laughed softly. "That rarely solves anything." "No." Jonathan looked at her thoughtfully. "You solved it differently." "No," she said. I didn't solve anything. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. No, no. She gestured lightly toward the city skyline behind them. The systems did. Jonathan followed her gaze. Glass towers reflected the afternoon sunlight. Thousands of employees inside those buildings moved through spreadsheets, contracts, financial reports, and decisions that shaped entire industries. Yes, he said. They did. Noelle turned back toward the lake. People think silence means weakness. Jonathan nodded. But sometimes it means patience. Yes. And patience, Jonathan said, can be powerful. They stood quietly for another moment. Finally, Jonathan asked one more question. If you could speak to Gerald now, he said, what would you say? Noelle thought carefully. Then she answered simply, nothing. Jonathan looked curious. Nothing at all, no. Why? She met his eyes. Because the truth already said everything, Jonathan smiled. The simplicity of that answer felt perfectly consistent with the woman he had come to know. Noelle Davenport had never needed to win arguments. She had never needed to prove herself through confrontation. Her strength came from observation, from patience, from the quiet certainty that facts once preserved could eventually speak louder than any accusation. And when they did, there was no need to raise her voice. The sun began lowering slowly toward the horizon, casting long reflections across the lake. People passed along the path behind them. Joggers, families, tourists, enjoying the warmer weather. Life continued, as it always did. Jonathan finally straightened. Ready to head home? He asked. Noelle nodded. Yes. They walked away from the railing together. Behind them, the water moved steadily against the shoreline. A reminder that time, like truth, rarely rushed. But it never stopped moving forward. The story of Noelle Davenport was never about revenge. It wasn't about humiliation or public victory. What made it powerful was something quieter. For years, Noelle watched the world around her with patience. When her marriage ended, she didn't shout accusations or chase validation. She simply kept the records of what had happened, emails, bank statements, confirmations that most people would have ignored. Those small details seemed insignificant at the time. But truth often hides inside ordinary things. When the moment finally came, Noelle didn't need to fight. She didn't need to argue. The facts spoke clearly enough on their own. Gerald Whitmore believed success meant standing in the right rooms, saying the right things, and being admired by the right people. What he never understood was that reputation built on appearances can disappear quickly when reality catches up. Noelle understood something different. She understood that dignity doesn't require noise. It requires consistency. And in the end, that quiet strength was the reason the truth was heard. If this story stayed with you even in a small way, take a moment before you leave. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always fascinating to see how far stories like this travel. And if you appreciate stories about quiet strength, accountability, and the moments when truth finally rises to the surface, you're welcome to stay with the channel by subscribing. There will always be more stories worth telling. Stories where patience matters. Stories where dignity outlasts arrogance. And stories where the quietest person in the room sometimes understands the most.